Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back, to an era where the idea of central heating was as fantastical as a dragon delivering your pizza. Imagine for a moment, you're nestled under your coziest blanket, maybe a cup of something warm steaming beside you, the gentle hum of your modern furnace a comforting lullaby. Now, strip that away. All of it. You're no longer in your climate-controlled bubble. Instead, you're in a drafty, smoky hovel, the kind of place where your breath hangs in the air like a ghostly whisper, and the only heat comes from a meager fire that seems to be actively trying to avoid warming you. You shiver, not from a stray draft, but from a bone-deep cold that has seeped into your very marrow, a constant, gnawing presence that never truly leaves. You eye the thin, scratchy wool tunic you're wearing, knowing it offers about as much protection from the biting wind as a wet tissue. You probably won't survive this, and honestly, even your ancestors probably thought it was a bit much. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in the heart of the European Middle Ages, a time often romanticized with knights and castles, but in reality, it was a period of relentless struggle, especially when the sun dipped low and the landscape transformed into a frozen wasteland. The climate itself was a brutal adversary. We're talking about the tail end of what historians call the medieval warm period. And then, bam, you hit the Little Ice Age. Not a full-blown ice age, mind you, but certainly a significant cooling trend that settled in for centuries, making already harsh winters infinitely worse. Think less White Christmas, and more Ice Road Truckers meets Game of Thrones. But without the plucky heroics or the convenient plot armor. You feel the constant dread of an early frost, a late snow, or a particularly savage winter storm that could wipe out your entire harvest, leaving you staring at an empty larder and an even emptier future. The sun, when it bothers to show its face, hangs low in the sky, a pale, watery disk offering more light than warmth. You watch the days shorten, the shadows lengthen, and a pervasive gloom settle over everything. The ground beneath your worn boots becomes hard as rock, frozen solid, and the rivers, once bustling arteries of trade and life, transform into impassable sheets of ice. It's not just an inconvenience, it's a death sentence for crops, for livestock, and for you, if you're not prepared. But here's the kicker. Preparation in the Middle Ages was more about hopeful wishing and a prayer to the heavens than any real scientific understanding of meteorology. You just hoped for the best, braced for the worst, and tried not to freeze your toes off. Historians still argue whether the extent of the Little Ice Age's impact was purely climatic or exacerbated by other societal factors. But one thing is clear, it made winters a nightmare. You might try to tell yourself it's just a particularly bad season, a fluke, but deep down, you know this is just how it is. It's the cycle of life and death, played out in the stark, frozen landscape around you. And as the first flakes of snow begin to drift from the iron-gray sky, you pull your thin cloak tighter, a shiver running down your spine that has nothing to do with the wind. As the first heavy snows settle, you find yourself retreating indoors, not into a cozy, well-insulated haven, but into a dwelling that's barely more than a glorified lean-to. Your home, whether it's a simple peasant's hut, a cramped urban dwelling, or even a section of a lesser noble's castle, is a testament to the era's rudimentary understanding of thermal dynamics. Walls are often constructed from wattle and daub, a charming mixture of woven branches and mud, topped with a thatched roof that, while picturesque, is about as effective at keeping out the cold as a colander is at holding water. You can literally feel the wind whistling through cracks in the walls, a constant, chilling reminder of the world outside. Imagine trying to sleep. You bundle yourself in whatever scraps of wool or animal hides you possess, but the floor, often just packed earth, radiates an icy cold that seeps up into your bones. The concept of a foundation, let alone insulation, is centuries away. Smoke, from your inadequate hearth fire, often fills the room, making your eyes water and your lungs burn. Ventilation is poor, not because people didn't want fresh air, but because every gap is a gateway for the soul-crushing cold. Your dwelling is less a sanctuary and more a slightly less exposed version of the outdoors. You've heard tales of grand Roman villas with their underfloor heating systems, the hypocausts, and while you can barely grasp the concept, you wish with every fiber of your being that such forgotten magic existed now. It's hard to fathom how people lived like this for generations, but then again, they didn't have much choice. Even in more substantial structures, like a lord's hall, you'd find that grandeur didn't equate to warmth. Massive, drafty stone halls, while impressive, were notoriously difficult to heat. You see the tapestries hanging on the walls, not just for decoration, but as a desperate attempt to mitigate the drafts, to trap some semblance of warmth within the vast, echoing space. You'd gather close to the enormous fireplaces, where a roaring blaze would devour vast quantities of wood. Yet the heat would quickly dissipate into the cavernous room, leaving the extremities of the hall in a perpetual chill. You might even find yourself sleeping with the livestock in a barn, if you were a peasant, as their body heat was often more reliable than your own meager fire. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of wattle and daub was purely due to material availability or if there was a deeper, perhaps forgotten, understanding of its insulating properties when properly maintained. Either way, for you, it just feels leaky. You remember that story your grandmother used to tell about the time a stray cat found its way into their hovel through a gap in the thatch and curled up by the fire, only to bolt out again, presumably realizing even that was too cold for it. You laugh, a dry, humorless sound, as you pull your threadbare blanket tighter, trying to ignore the chill that creeps up your back. You dream of thick, solid walls, of windows that actually seal, and perhaps a chimney that pulls smoke out instead of artfully distributing it throughout your living space. But these are just dreams, fleeting comforts in a harsh reality where your home is a constant reminder of winter's brutal grip. It's truly a test of endurance, just existing within these flimsy walls. With your inadequate shelter offering little respite, your attention inevitably turns to the rumbling in your stomach. Winter in the Middle Ages isn't just about the cold. It's a relentless siege on your very sustenance. You're living in a world where food scarcity is a constant companion, a looming shadow that grows larger with every passing snowfall. The harvest, your only real hope, concluded months ago, and now you're entirely reliant on what was stored, or more accurately, what could be stored. Imagine your larder. It's not brimming with frozen pizzas or bags of perfectly preserved vegetables. Instead, you're looking at barrels of salted meat, if you're lucky enough to afford such a luxury, or perhaps some dried fish. Grains like wheat, barley, or rye form the bedrock of your diet, but even these are vulnerable to damp and vermin. You watch anxiously as your meager stores dwindle, each portion carefully measured, each crumb accounted for. Fresh produce is a distant memory, a forgotten luxury from the long-gone summer. You crave the simple sweetness of an apple or the crisp bite of a carrot, but such things are simply not available until the spring thaw. The methods of food preservation are primitive, to say the least. Salting, smoking, and drying are your only options. You've tasted salt pork so heavily cured it feels like chewing on a leather boot, and smoked fish that, while preserving it, leaves a lingering taste of wood smoke that permeates everything. You remember that quirky tidbit your uncle used to share, about how some resourceful peasants would bury root vegetables deep in the ground, hoping the earth's natural insulation would keep them from freezing solid for a bit longer. It was a gamble, of course, often ending in frozen, ruined mush, but a gamble you might be desperate enough to take. The threat of famine isn't just a concept, it's a palpable fear that tightens its grip with each passing day. A bad harvest in the preceding autumn means certain starvation for many in your community. You see the gaunt faces, the hollow eyes of your neighbors, mirroring your own increasing hunger. The calories you consume are barely enough to keep you warm, let alone provide the energy needed for daily labor. Every task, from chopping firewood to mending tools, feels like a monumental effort, draining what little strength you possess. Historians still argue whether the frequency of famines in this period was primarily due to climate factors or exacerbated by ineffective agricultural practices and poor transportation networks. For you, The reason matters little. The gnawing emptiness in your stomach is all too real. You recall last year, during a particularly harsh spell, when your family was forced to grind dried pea pods into a coarse flour to mix with what little grain you had left. It tasted like sorrow and desperation, but it kept you alive. You dream of the spring, of the first shoots of green, of the wild herbs and berries that will eventually appear. Until then, you endure. The constant dull ache of hunger, a persistent reminder of winter's brutal efficiency in cutting off the very source of life. You learn to ignore the hunger pangs, or at least to live with them, understanding that this is simply the cost of survival until the earth yields its bounty once more. As if the gnawing hunger and pervasive cold weren't enough, winter brings with it another, even more insidious enemy: disease. You exist in a time where the very concept of germs is centuries away from discovery. Sanitation is rudimentary at best, and often non-existent. You live in close quarters with family, neighbors, and livestock, creating perfect breeding grounds for illness. When winter clamps down, trapping everyone indoors, these conditions become a catastrophic recipe for widespread sickness. Imagine the common cold. For you, it's not a minor inconvenience. It's a potentially life-threatening ordeal. A simple cough can escalate into pneumonia. A fever can quickly become a deadly delirium. You see it all around you. Children with runny noses that never seem to clear, adults racked with coughing fits that leave them gasping for breath. There are no antibiotics, no antivirals, no understanding of how to prevent the spread. Your only recourse is prayer, herbal remedies passed down through generations, many of which are more superstition than science, and perhaps a visit from the local wise woman, whose efficacy is as much about comfort as cure. Epidemics, often sparked by conditions during the winter months, are terrifyingly common. Dysentery, influenza, smallpox, and other virulent diseases sweep through communities with horrifying speed. You witness firsthand how quickly an illness can decimate a household, then a village. The cold itself weakens your immune system, making you more susceptible, and the lack of fresh food leads to deficiencies that further compromise your body's defenses. You often hear stories of entire families perishing in their homes, leaving behind only the chilling silence of absence. You remember that one winter, a few years back, when your neighbor's youngest child developed the sweating sickness, a mysterious and swift illness that left him lifeless within days. It's a constant dread that hangs over your head, more terrifying than any bandit. The quirky tidbit you've heard is how some people, desperate for any remedy, would resort to bizarre practices, like applying dried toad powder or even pigeon droppings to wounds and fevers, believing they held curative powers. Spoiler alert, they didn't. This lack of medical knowledge meant that even minor ailments could become fatal. Historians still argue whether the Black Death's initial spread was exacerbated by colder winters, which forced people into closer quarters, or if its sheer virulence transcended environmental factors. For you, it's just another terror to add to the list. You watch as people around you succumb, and you say your quiet prayers, hoping you or your loved ones won't be next. The sheer helplessness in the face of illness is demoralizing. There's no hospital, no doctor with sterile instruments. If you fall ill, you rely on the strength of your own body and a large dose of sheer luck. You try to keep clean, knowing instinctively that filth breeds sickness, but without running water or effective soap, it's an uphill battle. The smell of sickness, of unwashed bodies and lingering disease, is a grim accompaniment to the pervasive cold. You pull your cloak tighter, not just against the chill, but against the invisible threats that dance in the stale air. Beyond the drafty walls and empty larders, you face the sheer inadequacy of your clothing against the medieval winter's bite. Forget high-tech synthetics, waterproof membranes, or even properly tailored, layered insulation. You're lucky if you have more than one or two outfits, and they are, by modern standards, laughably insufficient. Your primary defense against the cold is wool, scratchy, often undyed, and prone to absorbing moisture rather than repelling it. Imagine pulling on a thick wool tunic and leggings, perhaps topped with a simple cloak. It sounds warm enough, right? But the reality is far from it. This wool is coarse, not the soft merino you might envision. It's heavy, itchy, and when it gets wet, it stays wet, conducting the cold straight to your skin. Layering exists, of course, but it's more about piling on whatever you have rather than strategic thermal management. You might wear an undertunic of linen, which offers little warmth, beneath your wool, but that's about the extent of your options. You dream of a goose-down sleeping bag, but for now, your goosebumps are doing all the heavy lifting. Footwear is another major vulnerability. Your boots are typically made of leather, often untanned or poorly processed, meaning they offer minimal water resistance. You trudge through snow and slush, feeling the damp cold seep through to your feet, chilling them to the bone. Frostbite is not some abstract medical term. It's a very real threat, leading to blackened toes and fingers, and often amputation if you're lucky enough to survive the infection. You've seen neighbors lose digits, a grim testament to winter's cruelty. Your hands, if not covered by thick, ill-fitting mittens or simple fabric wraps, quickly become numb, making even basic tasks agonizingly painful. Head coverings are essential, but again, they're simple wool hoods or caps, offering limited protection from the wind that seems to find every exposed patch of skin. You might try to wrap scarves around your face, but the fabric quickly stiffens with frozen breath, turning into an icy mask. The quirky tidbit you often hear from older villagers is how, during particularly brutal winds, they'd smear animal grease on exposed skin, hoping it would create a barrier against the frost. It sounds disgusting, and it probably was, but desperation breeds strange remedies. Historians still argue whether the lack of advanced textile technology was primarily due to limited knowledge, or if the resources simply weren't available for widespread production of finer, more effective fabrics. Either way, for you, it means constant discomfort. You become intimately familiar with the persistent ache of cold in your joints, the burning sensation of chilblains on your fingers and toes, and the overall sensation of never truly being warm. You long for the feeling of dry, warm socks, a concept so foreign it might as well be magic. Every movement is a conscious effort to conserve what little body heat you have, and the thought of simply standing still for too long fills you with dread. With flimsy clothing and drafty homes, your primary battle against the medieval winter becomes the relentless pursuit of heat. And in this era, heat almost exclusively means fire. But even fire, that most ancient and comforting of elements, is a fickle and often insufficient ally. Imagine your hearth. It's the heart of your home, yes, but it's often little more than an open pit in the center of your dwelling, or a crude stone structure against one wall. There's no sophisticated chimney system pulling smoke efficiently upwards. Instead, much of it billows into your living space, stinging your eyes and coating everything in a fine layer of soot. You choke on the acrid fumes, your lungs protesting with every breath. You huddle close to the flames, feeling the intense heat on one side of your body while the other remains stubbornly cold, exposed to the drafts. It's like trying to warm an entire auditorium with a single candle, utterly futile. The biggest challenge, however, isn't just the inefficiency of your hearth, but the constant, back-breaking labor of acquiring fuel. Wood is king. You spend endless hours in the bitter cold, chopping down trees, splitting logs, and hauling heavy bundles back to your home. It's a relentless cycle, a desperate race against the dwindling daylight and the ever-present cold. Every piece of firewood is precious, and you learn to guard your stack with fierce possessiveness. You know that running out of fuel means not just discomfort, but a very real threat to your survival. You also know that green wood, freshly cut, burns poorly, spitting and hissing rather than offering a steady flame. So, you need seasoned wood, which means planning months, even years, in advance. This constant demand for wood leads to widespread deforestation in many areas, a slow, grim testament to humanity's struggle against the elements. You might try to burn peat, if you're in a boggy region, or even dried animal dung, if you're truly desperate and out of other options. You recall that quirky tidbit about some peasants drying cow patties on their walls during summer, a truly aromatic way to prepare for winter. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of inventive, if smelly, fuel sources. Even if you manage to keep a fire going, the heat quickly dissipates into the vast, uninsulated space. Sleeping near the dying embers offers a fleeting warmth, but the moment you stir from your slumber, the cold reasserts its dominance. There's no concept of residual heat in the walls, no central heating system to maintain a steady temperature. Historians still argue whether medieval deforestation was solely driven by the need for fuel or if agricultural expansion played a larger role. For you, the reason is simple. You need to keep from freezing to death. You learn to interpret the crackle of the flames, the way the smoke curls, as a vital sign. The fire isn't just warmth, it's a flickering beacon of hope in the endless dark, a fragile barrier between you and the brutal, indifferent cold outside. As winter tightens its grip, the world outside your drafty dwelling transforms into a formidable, often impassable, barrier. You might think travel is simply inconvenient in the cold, but in the Middle Ages, it becomes a perilous undertaking, fraught with danger and often ending in tragedy. The primitive roads, which are barely more than dirt tracks in the best of times, become treacherous quagmires of frozen mud, slick ice, or deep, impassable snowdrifts. Imagine setting out on a journey, even a short one, to the nearest market town. Your horse, if you're fortunate enough to own one, slips and stumbles on the icy ground, its breath pluming in the frigid air. The wheels of your cart, if you have one, sink into snow that seems to swallow them whole. You, wrapped in your inadequate clothing, feel the biting wind lash at your face, stinging your exposed skin. Blizzards can materialize seemingly out of nowhere, reducing visibility to mere feet and making it impossible to distinguish the path from the featureless white landscape. Getting lost is not just a nuisance, it's a death sentence in the sub-zero temperatures. You've heard the chilling tales of travelers found frozen solid, sometimes just a few hundred yards from their destination, victims of disorientation and the relentless cold. Rivers, once vital arteries for trade and movement, freeze solid. While this sometimes creates temporary ice bridges, allowing passage where none existed before, it's a gamble. You never truly know the thickness or stability of the ice, and falling through could mean immediate hypothermia in the icy water, or worse, being swept away beneath the frozen surface. You remember that quirky tidbit about some communities developing specific rituals or even superstitions around crossing frozen rivers, believing certain prayers or offerings could ensure safe passage. It offered little actual protection, but perhaps a scrap of comfort. Banditry, always a risk, can become even more desperate in winter. Hungry and cold, brigands may become bolder, knowing that travelers are fewer and often carrying what precious few supplies they have. Your greatest fear, however, isn't just human predators, but the raw, unyielding power of nature itself. A broken axle, a lame horse, or a sudden change in weather can leave you stranded, exposed to the elements, with little hope of rescue. Historians still argue whether winter travel significantly impacted the broader economic output of medieval Europe, or if regional trade simply adapted to seasonal closures. For you, the answer is moot. You're focused on surviving the journey, so you largely stay put. The world shrinks to your village, your farm, your immediate surroundings. The idea of a casual day trip is as alien as the concept of space travel. Every journey is a calculated risk, undertaken only out of dire necessity. You learn to read the sky, to interpret the subtle shifts in wind, to gauge the depth of the snow, understanding that your life, quite literally, depends on these observations. The world outside becomes a vast, indifferent, and lethally beautiful expanse, a place you venture into only when truly compelled, always with a knot of fear in your stomach. As travel becomes a dangerous gamble, you find yourself increasingly confined, and with that confinement comes a profound sense of social isolation. The vibrant, bustling life of the warmer months, with its communal gatherings, market days, and open-door hospitality, slowly grinds to a halt. The world shrinks, not just physically due to impassable roads, but socially, as communities become insular islands in a sea of snow and ice. Imagine the silence. No distant chatter from a neighboring village, No sound of carts rumbling down the road. The only sounds are the howl of the wind, the crackle of your meager fire, and the muffled quiet of a snow-laden world. Your social circle dwindles to your immediate family, and perhaps a handful of very close neighbors who live within a short, manageable distance. Gone are the opportunities to meet new people, to share news and gossip from afar, or to participate in larger festive gatherings. You are, in essence, cut off. This isolation isn't just about missing a good party. It means limited access to vital information, to potential aid, or even to a sense of broader community. If someone falls ill in a remote hamlet, word might not reach a healer or priest for days, by which time it could be too late. If a family runs out of food, their plight might go unnoticed until it's too dire to remedy. You feel a palpable sense of being adrift, detached from the wider world. You might try to send a messenger, but the risk of them perishing in the snow or getting lost is significant. The lack of social interaction takes its toll on morale. Humans are, by nature, social creatures, and prolonged isolation can lead to despondency and a sense of hopelessness. You find yourself spending more time in quiet contemplation, sometimes bordering on despair, as the days bleed into weeks and the winter shows no sign of relenting. You hear tales of people who, driven by the isolation and hunger, began to suffer from what some called winter madness, a form of severe depression or delusion brought on by the relentless hardship. You remember that quirky tidbit about some monasteries in remote areas, completely cut off for months, resorting to intricate illuminated manuscripts or long, solitary prayers to maintain their sanity. Historians still argue whether the perceived increase in superstitions and local folklore during winter months was a direct result of social isolation or simply a heightened focus on storytelling in the absence of other forms of entertainment. For you, it means huddling around the fire, listening to grim tales and ancient myths, finding a strange comfort in shared fears. The collective vulnerability creates a unique bond within your immediate circle, a reliance on each other that is both comforting and terrifying. You are your family's world, and they are yours, for better or worse, until the thaw brings the promise of reconnection. You long for the day when you can once again see a familiar face from outside your small, snowbound world. As the isolation deepens, so too does the grip of winter on the very fabric of your economic life. For you, living in the medieval world, the economy isn't some abstract concept discussed in a university hall. It's the immediate, tangible reality of whether you have enough to survive. And in winter, that reality often borders on economic collapse. Imagine your primary source of income, whether it's farming, artisanal craft, or simple labor. In winter, most of these activities grind to a halt. The frozen ground makes tilling impossible, trade routes become impassable, and construction ceases. You, the laborer, find yourself without work, and thus without coin. The market, which in warmer months bustled with activity, becomes a desolate, wind-swept space where only the most essential and hardy goods might occasionally be bartered. You see the desperation in the eyes of others, reflecting your own fear of an empty purse and an empty larder. The limited movement of goods means that prices for what is available skyrocket. Grain, if it can even be transported, becomes exorbitantly expensive. Salt, essential for preserving what little meat you have, becomes a precious commodity. You might have some stored goods, perhaps a small surplus from a good harvest, but if you need to sell to buy something else, you're at the mercy of wildly fluctuating prices driven by scarcity. It's a vicious cycle. No work means no money, but even if you had money, the goods you need are scarce and overpriced. This economic stagnation isn't just about personal hardship, it ripples through the entire community. Merchants can't travel, so goods don't move between towns. Feudal lords, whose income relies on agricultural output and taxes, find their coffers dwindling. The entire system slows to a crawl, teetering on the brink of widespread insolvency. You remember that quirky tidbit your grandfather used to tell, about how some villagers would meticulously repair every tool, every piece of clothing, and even collect every stray piece of wood during the winter, not just for survival, but because no new goods or materials would be arriving until spring. It was a testament to the sheer self-sufficiency forced upon them. Historians still argue whether the overall economic decline of the late medieval period was more a result of climatic shifts like the Little Ice Age, which impacted agricultural output, or if it was predominantly due to socio-political factors such as endemic warfare and inefficient feudal systems. For you, these academic debates are far removed from the chilling reality of your empty hands and the knowledge that your family's survival depends on resources that are simply not flowing. You learn to make do, to stretch every last scrap, to repair rather than replace. The quiet hum of winter is often accompanied by the quiet hum of an idle loom or a silent forge, a constant reminder of the frozen economy. You understand, with a cold clarity, that winter doesn't just chill your bones. It freezes your very means of existence. The relentless physical hardships of a medieval winter, the cold, the hunger, the pervasive sickness, exact a profound toll not just on your body, but on your mind. You find yourself grappling with the often overlooked aspect of this brutal season, the psychological toll. It's a weariness that goes beyond physical exhaustion, a constant mental strain that grinds down your spirit. Imagine the relentless monotony. Days blend into weeks, then months, marked only by the dwindling light and the ever-present cold. There's little to distract you from the grim realities. No vibrant entertainments, no easy access to new stories or faces, just the same four walls, the same anxieties, the same battle for survival. The lack of natural light, especially during the shortest days, contributes to a pervasive sense of gloom. You feel a creeping melancholy, a form of seasonal despair that settles deep in your bones, much like the cold itself. The constant fear is a heavy burden. Fear of starvation, fear of sickness, fear of freezing to death. This isn't a fleeting worry. It's a persistent, gnawing dread that never truly leaves you. Every cough from a child, every shiver, every dwindling ration, sends a fresh wave of anxiety through you. You're always calculating, always assessing risk, always trying to stretch meager resources. This constant state of high alert is mentally exhausting, leaving you drained and vulnerable. You find yourself less patient, more irritable, easily frustrated by minor setbacks, because every setback feels like a potential catastrophe. The lack of control over your circumstances is also incredibly demoralizing. You can chop wood, you can mend your clothes, you can ration your food, but you cannot stop the snow, you cannot bring back the sun, and you cannot conjure food from thin air. You are utterly at the mercy of the elements, a feeling of helplessness that can lead to a profound sense of fatalism. You recall that quirky tidbit about some communities developing elaborate winter solstice rituals, not just for religious observance, but as a desperate, collective act of defiance against the encroaching darkness, a way to mentally push back against the feeling of powerlessness. Historians still argue whether instances of heightened mental health crises, like increased cases of what we now identify as severe depression or even paranoia, were more prevalent during medieval winters, or if they were simply undocumented in a society that lacked the language and understanding for such conditions. For you, the experience is intensely personal. You might find yourself staring blankly at the wall, lost in thought, struggling to find any spark of hope. You cling to small comforts, the warmth of a weak fire, a brief moment of sunlight, the shared silence with a loved one. The psychological burden of winter is an unseen weight, pressing down on you, testing the very limits of your endurance. You long for the mental lightness that comes with warmer days and the promise of renewal. Among all the suffering that winter brought, the most heartbreaking and stark reality you face is the extreme vulnerability of children. In a time before modern medicine, adequate nutrition, and insulated homes, the very youngest members of your community are disproportionately affected by the season's brutal grip. For them, medieval winter isn't just harsh. It's a terrifying gauntlet where survival itself is a daily miracle. Imagine a newborn, swaddled in thin cloth, trying to regulate its tiny body temperature in a drafty hut where your own breath steams. Infants and young children, with their undeveloped immune systems and inability to articulate their discomfort, are particularly susceptible to the cold. Hypothermia can set in quickly, even indoors. You witness babies with persistent coughs that never clear, their small bodies racked by fevers that offer little hope of recovery. Child mortality rates during the Middle Ages were astronomically high, and winter was a primary reaper. You learn to brace yourself for the worst, to grieve quickly, and to simply hope for the best for your own little ones. Their hunger is even more heartbreaking than your own. Children require a consistent intake of nutrient-rich food for growth and development, but winter offers little beyond bland, starchy grains and salted meats. You see the signs of malnutrition, stunted growth, swollen bellies, and a pervasive listlessness in eyes that should be bright with curiosity. Rickets, caused by a lack of vitamin D from sunlight, is common, leaving children with deformed bones and lifelong infirmities. You might try to coax a bit more gruel into a reluctant child, knowing that every calorie is vital, every mouthful a small victory against the looming threat of starvation. Play, essential for a child's development, is severely limited. Trapped indoors, with little space and fewer toys, children often succumb to boredom and the general gloom. You might try to tell them stories or play simple games, but the pervasive cold and hunger drain their energy and spirits. You see them shivering by the fire, their faces pale, their tiny fingers and toes often red and chapped from the cold. You remember that one quirky tidbit about children in some regions learning to read the ice on puddles, discerning its thickness from the patterns, a macabre game born of necessity to avoid falling through. Historians still argue whether the emotional bonds between parents and children in medieval society were different due to the high mortality rates, leading to a more detached emotional approach, or if the love was just as profound despite the constant threat of loss. For you, the answer is irrelevant. You love your children fiercely, and the helplessness you feel as you watch them suffer through the winter is a pain unlike any other. You pray over their cribs, whisper reassurances, and bundle them as tightly as possible, knowing that all your efforts might still not be enough. The silent, tearful burials of tiny coffins become an all too frequent and soul-crushing ritual in the depths of winter. Beyond the human toll, you witness the devastating impact of winter on another vital part of your existence: your animals. For medieval people, livestock wasn't merely a source of food. It was wealth, power, and often, the very means of survival. A single cow, a handful of sheep, or even a sturdy ox could be the difference between life and death for a family. When winter strikes, your animals suffer just as much, if not more, than you do, and their loss can be catastrophic. Imagine the barns, often little more than flimsy wooden structures, offering only slightly better protection than your own hovel. Animals huddle together for warmth, their breath steaming in the frigid air. You see their ribs protruding, their coats dull and matted. Fodder, like hay and straw, collected painstakingly during the warmer months, is carefully rationed. Just like your own food stores, these supplies dwindle with agonizing speed, leading to a desperate scramble for any remaining forage. You watch your precious animals, the very foundation of your livelihood, weaken day by day. The cold itself is a direct killer. Livestock, particularly sheep and younger animals, are highly susceptible to hypothermia and frostbite. You wake to find a lamb stiff and cold, or a chicken frozen solid in its coop. Disease, often exacerbated by close confinement and weakened immune systems from malnutrition, sweeps through herds and flocks. You become intimately familiar with the symptoms of various animal ailments, knowing that once they take hold, there's little you can do beyond desperate, often futile, remedies. A widespread animal plague during winter could mean the ruin of an entire village, leaving families without milk, meat, wool, or even the dung needed for fertilizer. You might try to bring some of the smaller animals, like chickens or even a calf, inside your own dwelling during the coldest nights, sharing what little warmth you have. It's a smelly, noisy arrangement, but a necessary one if you want them to survive. You remember that quirky tidbit your grandfather passed down, how some peasants would give their sick animals diluted herbal brews, believing that if it was good enough for humans, it might help a dying cow. It often didn't, but the effort spoke to the desperation. The loss of an animal is more than just an economic setback, it's an emotional blow. You've cared for these creatures, sometimes from birth, and their suffering is palpable. Every frozen carcass is a stark reminder of winter's brutal power. Historians still argue whether the consistent losses of livestock during medieval winters significantly shaped the agricultural practices of the time, leading to smaller, hardier breeds, or if other factors like land availability were more influential. For you, the sight of a beloved animal perishing is a profound tragedy, a direct threat to your family's ability to survive the coming year. You tend to your remaining animals with a fierce protectiveness, knowing that their survival is inextricably linked to your own. As weeks of unrelenting cold turn into months, and your food stores dwindle, another critical resource becomes increasingly scarce: fuel. You might have initially started the winter with a decent stack of firewood, perhaps even some peat, but the continuous demand for warmth means these supplies are shrinking rapidly. You face the looming threat of resource depletion, a cold, hard fact that often dictates whether your family sees the spring. Imagine the daily struggle. Every morning begins with the assessment of your woodpile. Is there enough for cooking? Enough to keep a meager fire going through the night? The answer is often a desperate barely. The easy-to-reach wood, the fallen branches and readily accessible trees, were harvested long ago. Now, you must venture further, deeper into the frozen forests, where the snow lies thick and the wind bites with renewed ferocity. You spend hours, sometimes entire days, toiling in the bitter cold, chopping down trees with primitive axes, hauling heavy logs back on your shoulders or on a crude sled. Every splinter in your hand, every ache in your back, is a testament to the immense effort required simply to stay warm. The demand for wood isn't just for your own hearth. Blacksmiths need charcoal for their forges, bakers need fuel for their ovens, and some industries, albeit limited in winter, still require timber. This competition further strains already dwindling resources. You might find yourself arguing with neighbors over rights to a particular stand of trees, or perhaps resorting to collecting every twig, every scrap of kindling, a desperate scavenger hunt in a landscape that offers less and less. You remember that quirky tidbit about some communities developing highly organized systems for communal woodcutting and distribution, sometimes overseen by the local lord or village elder, to prevent total depletion and ensure everyone had at least some basic access. It was an early form of resource management, born out of sheer necessity. Running out of wood means more than just being cold. It means no hot food, no boiled water to reduce the risk of disease, and no small beacon of light and warmth in the long, dark nights. You might resort to burning anything that will offer a fleeting flame: dried grasses, old rags, even furniture if desperation truly sets in. The smoke from these makeshift fuels is often worse, filling your lungs and stinging your eyes, but the alternative is far grimmer. Historians still argue whether medieval deforestation directly led to localized climate changes, exacerbating the Little Ice Age's effects, or if the sheer scale of the cooling trend dwarfed any human impact on the forests. For you, the trees are simply a finite resource, and their diminishing presence means a colder, harder winter. You learn to conserve every ember, to bank your fire meticulously, and to pray for an early thaw that will allow you to stop this desperate, exhausting search for warmth. In the face of such overwhelming hardship, it's only natural that you, living in the medieval world, would turn to the heavens for answers, comfort, and perhaps a glimmer of hope. Winter, with its relentless brutality, often brought with it a heightened sense of religious interpretation and a deepened reliance on faith. You sought meaning in the suffering, believing it to be part of a divine plan, a test, or perhaps even a punishment. Imagine the long, dark nights. With little else to occupy your mind, your thoughts often drift to the spiritual. The church, whether a grand cathedral or a humble village chapel, becomes a focal point of community life, a place where people gather for warmth, shared solace, and collective prayer. You attend services, huddling with your neighbors, seeking reassurance in the familiar rituals and the comforting words of the priest. The sermons often emphasize perseverance, the fleeting nature of earthly suffering, and the promise of eternal reward. You cling to these messages, trying to find strength in a world that offers so little physical comfort. The harshness of winter often fueled superstitious beliefs and local folklore, intertwining with official Christian doctrine. You hear tales of ancient spirits of the cold, of frost giants, or of saints whose miracles were said to have protected villages from famine or plague. Sometimes, these beliefs offered a sense of agency, a way to understand or even placate the unseen forces that seem to control your fate. You might participate in local customs or rituals, perhaps lighting candles to ward off malevolent spirits, or making small offerings at specific holy sites, believing these acts could bring divine favor or protection. You remember that quirky tidbit about some peasants leaving out offerings of bread or milk for benevolent house spirits during winter, hoping to ensure good fortune and a measure of warmth for the coming year. The church itself played a central role, not just spiritually, but practically. Monasteries often provided what little charity existed, offering shelter, food, or medical care to those on the brink of starvation or death. You might journey to a nearby abbey, desperate for assistance, hoping that the monks, insulated by their vows and their somewhat better-stocked larders, could offer some relief. Historians still argue whether the church's immense power during this period was primarily due to its spiritual authority, or if its practical role as a provider of social welfare, especially during times of crisis like severe winters, cemented its influence. For you, the answer is simple. The church is a beacon in the darkness, a source of hope when all other avenues seem closed. You pray for the spring, for the return of light and warmth, believing that your suffering is being observed, and that perhaps a merciful hand will eventually intervene. The constant prayers, the quiet contemplation, and the shared faith become a vital psychological shield against the relentless onslaught of winter's despair. After months of enduring the biting winds, the gnawing hunger, and the pervasive darkness, you begin to perceive the faintest, most subtle shift in the air. It's almost imperceptible at first, a whisper of change that fills you with a fragile, desperate hope, the slow, agonizingly gradual return of spring. You yearn for it with every fiber of your being, for it signifies not just warmer weather, but a reprieve from death itself. Imagine the lengthening of the days. It's not a sudden burst of sunlight, but a minute-by-minute stretching of the daylight hours, each extra sliver of victory against the encroaching gloom. The sun, once a pale, distant orb, begins to feel a fraction stronger on your face. The snow, which seemed an eternal blanket, starts to soften at its edges, revealing patches of dark, frozen earth beneath. You notice the drips from the thatched roof, a tiny, tentative song of melting ice. It's a slow, hesitant awakening, like a slumbering giant stirring from a long, deep sleep. Your senses, dulled by months of cold, begin to reawaken. You catch the faint, earthy smell of thawing soil, a scent that promises life and growth. The sound of water, trickling and running, replaces the harsh crunch of snow underfoot. Birds, once silent or departed, begin to reappear, their hesitant chirps growing into a chorus. You listen intently, trying to discern the first robin's call, a traditional harbinger of spring, a quirky tidbit you've heard since childhood. Every one of these small signs is amplified in its significance, becoming a potent symbol of survival and renewal. But this isn't a sudden, joyous burst into lush greenery. The spring thaw often brings its own set of dangers. Melting snow swells rivers, leading to floods that can wash away precious topsoil or even entire homes. The ground turns to thick, clinging mud, making travel just as difficult, if not more so, than the frozen ground. Diseases, which festered in the close quarters of winter, can now spread more easily as people and animals begin to move again. You know that even as hope blossoms, vigilance remains paramount. Historians still argue whether the emotional relief of spring's arrival outweighed the practical challenges of flooding and renewed disease spread from medieval communities. For you, the sheer psychological lift is undeniable. You start to envision the tasks ahead, repairing fences, preparing the fields for planting, mending tools that have sat idle for months. The thought of fresh greens, of the first shoots of wild garlic or nettles, fills you with an almost unbearable craving. The promise of fresh milk from new calves, of eggs from reawakened hens, is a powerful motivator. You know the struggle isn't over. The spring brings its own labors and uncertainties. But as you watch the last stubborn drifts of snow shrink and vanish, you feel a profound shift within you. The relentless burden of winter slowly begins to lift, replaced by a cautious, yet undeniable, sense of relief and the enduring, quiet hope of new beginnings. The light outside your window is fading now, and perhaps, just like the medieval peasant you've walked beside tonight, you feel the familiar pull of rest after a long day. Let the echoes of those brutal winters, the chill in the bones, the gnawing hunger, gently fade into the quiet comfort of your own warm bed. The struggles of their world are far behind us, replaced by the soft hum of modern life. As the night deepens, let your mind drift from the drafty huts and frozen fields, and instead, settle into the warmth and safety of your own space. Breathe in, breathe out, letting every lingering thought of medieval hardship dissolve into the quiet stillness of your room. End of script. Sweet dreams.